Hey everybody, John Michael here. Witchcraft has always belonged to the outsiders and the outcasts in our society, and yet much of our practice traditionally enforces and adheres to the same hierarchy that we face in the world at large, a hierarchy that isolates and hurts those living beyond society's binary and boundaries that are constructs, human-made constructs. And while there are books out there that address magic for the resistance and queer mythos, until now, there's been none that specifically address the practice of queer magic from an LGBTQ standpoint. And today's guest, I am so excited, will share their journey and the message that they brilliantly convey in the book, Queering Your Craft. More on that when we return. And welcome back, everybody. Andrea, welcome. It's so good to have this opportunity. I know you're as excited as I am about our guest today.
I absolutely love Cassandra's book. This is my favorite book I've read this whole year, so I'm just really excited to dig in.
I couldn't agree more. So let's go ahead and bring Cassandra in. Normally we talk, just all of the normal stuff that we say. Thank you for liking and subscribing and sharing the material with somebody that you think this might touch. I think today probably this is an even more important time to say that if there's somebody that you think this message can vibe with or could heal or could really move, then please, thank you in advance for sharing and liking it. This is a live show too, so we welcome you to, I will try to do my best to keep an eye on the comment section so that we can put them up on screen. If you have any questions for our guests and you want them to, or you want to just, tell them how you felt about reading their book, then please do that. But let's go ahead and bring her into the screen, into the room. Cassandra, welcome.
Hi. Thank y'all so much for having me. I'm really excited.
We are too. And Cassandra is a professional tarot reader, a teacher, writer, and theater maker in Minneapolis, whose writing focuses on topics that range from, as I said, tarot and paganism, arts, journalism, queer lifestyle, and personal storytelling. Their first book was Queering the Tarot, which I have to say is also an incredible book. But we really wanted to focus on the latest book today and talk about what Andrea and I both think is one of the most visionary books ever written on queer magic on the margins and the craft. And so, Cassandra, I am so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today. It's so nice to talk to people who really get what you're doing and are excited about it. So I'm really happy.
As we get started, I'm just going to go ahead and because I will probably get so enthralled that I forget to do this. The book we're talking about today is Queering Your Craft, Witchcraft from the Margins. I finally got smart enough to know that if I do that, I don't have to try to get the book right in the shot. And we will make sure that after the show, we go ahead and put a link in the About section or in the comments on Facebook. But as we get started, Cassandra, tell us about your path and what led you to where you are today.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Bible Belt. And I grew up, every bit the good Christian girl that I was supposed to be. And to be clear, that was never pressure from my family. It actually was a lot of peer pressure. It's a very weird place to live. My family has always been generally pretty open. But I wanted to have friends and fit in and all of that. So I really put myself through a lot of really difficult things because of that. Because of trying to follow this path that wasn't right for me. And I had a pretty tumultuous upbringing. And then one thing I did really lean on my faith until my freshman year of college. And then I was just slammed with even more trauma. It was the worst year of my life by far. Even this year, everyone's like 2020 is the worst. And I'm like, I got through freshman year. I got this. Not that it's been easy, but yeah. But what was really hard in freshman year was the new trauma happened, and my Christian friends really, really weren't there for me. And it made me feel very cut off from spirituality in general, which is typically not a good sign. I know as a solo witch practitioner, I feel fine practicing on my own now that I have this more sort of genuine connection to that spirituality. But I was making really solid connections with my theater friends, and they were sort of experimenting with spirituality, with divination, very, college age things. But for me, it really stuck, and it really was something that helped me heal, helped me be honest about who I was. I was still very in the closet at that point. And it like now I'm so out, and it's like every facet of, and it's like so wild to me to think there was a time when I was in the closet, especially as an adult, like most kids are. But I really didn't feel comfortable coming out till I was 23, which I know is young to some people, but not the newer queers, which is great. Yeah, and it really was such a focal point for me. And then when I tried to share it with other people, not in any sort of evangelistic way, because I'm pretty anti that, but in just as I think it's great, and it was so helpful and healing. People who were also queer, also LGBTQ, but I would also say also impoverished, which I have been most of my life, also in struggling with chronic pain and illness. They had questions, they had concerns about if this was really for them. And I sort of had to develop my own path so that I could answer those questions, even for myself. And I think that, you can solve most problems through yourself for critical thinking, but that's exhausting, and you don't have to. There should be people who are willing to make it easier for you, especially if you're marginalized. You're dealing with enough stuff. You shouldn't have to connect every single dot in order to be able to, especially to just try something or practice something, or see if it works for you. And then my own personal pagan witchcraft path, I started, it was the Bible Belt. Accesses were very limited. So it was originally Wiccan authors I was reading. That stopped working for me too. There was a lot of the same binary, a lot of the same hierarchy. I know a lot of amazing Wiccans, and it works for them. And I still practice with them sometimes. But now my practice is very deeply rooted in my own Celtic roots, as well as I'm now exploring. I have some very far back ancestors that have some Slavic ancestry that I'm exploring now too. And it's been really interesting to see the contrast. I'm studying occultism just because so many of my tarot students are so into it, and have connected more with that than I really expected to. So what I'm doing is really now today is really like a mishmash, I would say, of everything I've learned over the past like 17 years. And I think that that's probably true for most magical practitioners. It does, even if you're in a certain path, it really does become like the accumulation of everything you learn and pick up along the way.
Well, I said before the show started, I was going to heavily rely on Andrea because of the impact this book had. So I'm kind of going to wuss out a little bit, and get the emotions under control before I dive in. Andrea, I know you love the book as much as I did.
I do.
Kick us off.
Well, I think one of the first things too, when I when I got the book, at first I was a little nervous. I'm like, am I allowed to read this? Because I don't identify as queer. And the minute I cracked your book and started reading it, I'm like, this should be required reading for anyone interested in witchcraft, because it is the most inclusive book I've ever read on witchcraft, which is where we need to be kind of going. And so one of my questions is, because it is such a powerful book for LGBTQ, but how do you see it as being for pretty much anyone who's ever felt marginalized, which is what I loved so much about your book?
Yeah. That question is always a little tricky for me to answer, just because I grew up poor in the Bible Belt. And a lot of people would assume that meant, but I grew up with a very sort of, I hate to say open-minded, but just like, liberal, progressive family. And so, which meant that one thing I was not sort of internalizing, in spite of the Bible Belt Christianity, was a lot of the, racism and classism and other things that were going on. Obviously, as someone who was growing up poor, I couldn't really give into the classism, but like some of the other stuff. And I say that to say that so much of the way I'm able to be so inclusive is like, I've always had friends that were sick. I've always had friends that were people of color. I've always had friends, growing up, I didn't have friends that were LGBTQ, but some of my first friends in college, outside of my sort of Christian surroundings, when I wasn't in like the little choir I was in or whatever, were LGBTQ plus, and were honestly a lot better friends than what I was dealing with in kind of that other area of my life. And certainly made it so much more comfortable for me to come out when I was ready. And so I think for me, it's honestly just second nature. But then I moved to the Midwest, where there's so many white people, and I was so surprised. Like, I was genuinely shocked. And obviously there are people of color here. I still have a lot of Black friends, a lot of Latinx friends. But yeah, I think for me, it really does come down to, do I want all of my friends to be able to read and get something from this? And so, and I think to that too, a lot of my friends aren't necessarily marginalized in the ways that we've talked about, but they were like bullied growing up, or they've always had trouble fitting in for whatever reason. And so when, I do think that when I talk about marginalization, I'm usually referring to like the political, academic, but I think certainly anyone who has been sort of outcast or pushed aside, like, my work is primarily for queer people. It's also for those people, people who found the same solace in like Rocky Horror live events that the queer kids did growing up, like that group of people. It's also for them.
Right on. I'm gonna, if I could for a minute, and I have to cheat because I have to put my glasses on to read it. There's a quote from a friend of the show, actually one of my first guests on the original version of this show, which was called The Brew, which was LGBTQ focused. Matt Oren, who wrote the foreword for your book, and I want to share that quote because we adore Matt, and I love Matt. I think that it just captured what I was thinking as I read this book. And Matt writes, as evident through the pages of this book, Snow holds a vision for the queer aspirant who hears the call to witchery, to find healing, empowerment, strength, and pride through their craft. Through the creative and unique journal prompts, introspection, rituals, and spells, Snow achieves this beautifully, and herein lays the perfect guide for the queer witch to stand in their power and stand beside others, truly queering our craft with compassion and pride. And I don't think that I could possibly have put that better. And so I think our viewers would really benefit from hearing what it means for you personally to be queer from your perspective, from your experience. And you kind of covered that a little bit in what you were just saying, but in a more, I guess I'm asking for just a more personal experience. What did being queer mean to you? Was it specifically gender queer? Was it specifically orientation? Was it something else? Was there a metaphysical component?
Yeah, so I always think almost like of lowercase q queer and capital Q queer. And so lowercase q queer is like anyone who wants to be here and is not straight and cisgender. If you're even fluid or kind of waffly on either of those, like that's all under the queer umbrella. And of course, I do identify as a lesbian as well as non-binary. So, you know, looking at gender and sexuality there. And then with the capital Q, I do think about, I hate to use the word political, especially now. I feel like it's become like people think that means a specific thing. When I say it, I mean people who aren't happy with the status quo, who don't want the status quo, who usually fit into lowercase queer as well. And I would say 99% do. But who, it's almost like, you know, equality is not enough. I'm going to march for all of those things. But that desire for liberation, not only for queer people, but for Black people, for disabled people, for Indigenous people, and honestly, for all of us, the system is so, like, no one is benefiting except those at the top. And when at my most generous and benevolent, I think they're not even benefiting because I think they're kind of dead inside. And I feel like lack of connection to emotion is like honestly a real tragedy. And so, but also like I'm not going to spend my time feeling sorry for those people. They did that to themselves. And so, yeah, for me, it really is about changing all of that and hoping to find something that will work for all of us. And a lot of times I get accused, or I don't want to say accused, but a lot of times people think that all of my work is like a call to activism. But I also feel like when you are a marginalized person, living your life your way, regardless of what capitalism says you should do, regardless of what white supremacy says you should do, that is a radical act. And that is an act of activism, especially if you stand by it and fight for it, even in the daily and the personal. Not everything that we call activism needs to be like a huge organizing thing. If you're a white person, talking to your family about racism is activism. And it's usually what your Black friends will ask you to do or tell you to do if you're paying attention. So I think, yeah, I ended at a weird place, but I think that's sort of what I think goes into that. And then in terms of what queer means to me in my life, it has also been like a balm. I am of the mindset, and I talk about this in the book. You know, a lot of people on the left politically, they say, you know, identity politics are bad, et cetera, et cetera. That I feel like that's a misuse of that word because it was originally, it'd be like supposed to be people who are so attached to their political parties that they don't vote outside of that. And it got co-opted by people who didn't want queer people, disabled people, people of color to have a space, even in leftist community. We'll see how much Twitter hate I get after this, but we'll. And so, but I think, and queer theory now, today, thinks that, you know, there's always been queer people, even when the constructs weren't there. There's, you know, and that history is evidence of proof, and that identity can be so important because it can be so healing when you realize there is a word for how you've always felt, for the people you've always connected to, for the people you've always loved and wanted more for. And then even when there's just a word to put on it, even I was 34 years old when I got a loose ADHD diagnosis, and I was still like, that explains so, and it didn't feel like a box. It felt like, oh, hey, there's a reason. Like, and so one thing, you know, my work is very geared towards liberation and also the personal healing, the personal empowerment, the personal liberation, where you feel like you can live outside of these constructs. And obviously we're a far away from most of us thinking we can do that. That is really important to me and is part of that sort of queer identity and experience as well.
And there's this quote here from Richard that is beautiful. It's a major step to draw power from where we are marginalized. And I think that's such a huge part of your book. And
yeah.
I mean, that to me was one of the things that, because witches are, we are considered on the margins, on the fringe, we work from that particular space. I think that kind of leads into my next question for you too, is when people pick up your book and are starting to read it, what are you hoping that they walk away with from that? Like what in their craft?
So two things, and one of them is more technical. But the first thing is I just hope everyone knows that there's a place for them, that there's witches, other magical practitioners that want to practice with them. That yes, there might be resistance from pagan community at large. There might be resistance from the world at large, but there is, a community, there is people and I think that knowing that you're not alone, it's almost like knowing there are words to help you explain yourself to yourself, is so powerful and is such a huge thing. And in general, I want people to feel like they have some insight into how to use magic for healing and growth, and then from there taking on the systems. But I think the second thing, one thing I was very conscious of from more of a witchcraft perspective than a queer perspective when I wrote this book, is that there's a lot of beginner books that talk about some of the same stuff I do, even like the materials, the timing, all of that. And a lot of times what people who are newly getting into witchcraft will ask me after they've read some of that is, well, what do I do now? Now that I have this stuff. And so I wanted my book to be very clear about what you should do now, what you should do with that information, in ways that I sort of line out for you, but then in ways that I sort of help you design through journal prompts and checklists and things like that. So I want everyone to walk away feeling like they can do some spiritual healing, spiritual empowerment, coming into your own desires, manifesting your own desires. I also want people to feel like they literally know what they're doing with the tools that I sort of lay out, so that they don't have that well, what now feeling.
I think one of the things that I so appreciated when I was reading the book was just that, you really bring the reader an opportunity. I think that especially for queer persons has been missing. I kind of felt the same way about Matt Oren's book for psychics. That for witchcraft, what you're doing is you're giving a really solid framework that can be used flexibly and fluidly as a jumping off point, but then allowing and encouraging us to dig deeper and kind of find that expression that's uniquely ours, because we're marginalized. Your expression of your magic is by its very nature different, is queer.
Yeah.
And in that queerness is such an untapped, often uncovered, sometimes suppressed part of the magic that's bigger than we could have ever imagined. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I would love for Andrea to speak to one of the big things that was a takeaway for her before we get into some more questions, because I think it fits and dovetails perfectly into what we're talking about. The book we're talking about today and the incredible author we're talking about is the book Queering Your Craft, Witchcraft from the Margins, and the author is Cassandra Snow. And we'll be back in just a moment after this public service announcement from the Charter for Compassion.
The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions,
calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves.
Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures.
To dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there. to honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being,
treating everybody without exception,
with absolute justice, equity, and respect.
It is also necessary in both public and private life
to refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain,
to act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest,
to impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody,
and to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies,
is a denial of our common humanity.
We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately,
and that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion.
We therefore call upon all men and women to restore compassion
to the center of morality and religion,
to return to the ancient principle
that any interpretation of Scripture
that breeds violence,
hatred,
or disdain
is illegitimate.
To ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information
about other traditions, religions, and cultures.
To encourage a positive appreciation of cultural
and religious diversity.
To cultivate
an informed empathy
with the suffering of all human beings,
even those
regarded as enemies.
We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world,
rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness.
Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries.
Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential for human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity.
It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable in the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community.
Back, and once again, we encourage everyone to go to charterforcompassion.org and to sign the charter and share your stories. Andrea, before the break, we were talking with a queer author and witch and tarot reader and mensch and all of those other things, Cassandra Snow, about her book, about their book. I apologize, Queering Craft and Queering Your Craft, and you and I were having a conversation yesterday that just really, as if I needed one more thing to have to really on my emotions. There was this brilliant insight that you had as a takeaway in reading the book. Why don't you share that?
Well, there was so many points in the book where the waterworks started, but this particular one was I felt like I've never read this in another book, and you just described it so beautifully. And it was the tendency in some of the pagan traditions to focus on womb worship. And for me, that was so incredibly validating to read your words about not reducing our power to our reproductive organs. And I say this as someone who really struggled with reproductive issues. I lost a child very traumatically late in the pregnancy with before my daughter was born, a couple of years after, but it was a struggle. And there's this feeling that happens, and I know this goes across to many different people and different ways, but there's this idea that I'm somehow not a woman because my reproductive organs don't work properly, or I'm less of a woman, or I'm less powerful, or because there is so much focus, and we've been marginalized because of our gender in so many different spiritual traditions. And also, like, another part of that particular chapter was talking about how, I know men who have more of a connection to Goddess than I do. Why are they being excluded from that, or being excluded from their ability to tap into that energy? We have that in all of us. So taking that away from just not reducing our spirituality to our physical organs, like that was just really big for me. So
Thank you. That is something that has been really important to me, more and more so over the years. It's bothered me from the beginning. And it has it's the beginning of my spiritual, witchcraft journey. And it, I was very much like protest too much in the beginning. I insisted it was like, I want my trans friends to be included. This is not inclusive. My trans friends who are non-binary or masculine of center are like not going to feel empowered from that place. And then my trans friends who are trans women are every bit as feminine, every bit as divine feminine. And I still maintain that. And then my own struggles with both gender, and I have very severe pelvic floor disorder and vaginismus. A year and a half later, I still really haven't made any progress, and that's because I waited 34 years to seek treatment. I mean, probably when I was like 2, I didn't know or care, but like I waited, my whole life to seek treatment. And so I was writing this book when I was sort of going through all of that. I talk a little bit about it in the afterword. And especially now, the pandemic has halted a lot of in-person physical therapy, especially something that is that personal and that is that like there's not really a safe way to do it. And so I think when I wrote the book, I was feeling good about everything. And I was like, it's so great to empower myself again from a place that is not that. And I feel like now, 8-9 months after not having access to physical therapy, I honestly feel very disconnected. I'm really struggling in that journey again. And I'm like, honestly, so glad for my own sake that I wrote what I wrote, because I can go back and look at it and be like, you are non-binary no matter what. I actually have the opposite problem where than you described, where I didn't really deal with gender stuff because I would just joke to partners like, I'm not a woman, my vagina doesn't even work, like, haha. And so when I started working towards that healing, and I want to be very, very clear, I don't think anyone else's genitals dictate their gender whatsoever. But dysphoria is very personal and very specific. And that's how it manifested for me. And so as I started my journey to heal, I kept panicking. And the thought I kept having was like, I'm not a woman. I don't want to go through this. And so I don't think I want to be clear. I don't think anyone should have to go through vaginismus and pelvic floor stuff. It's horrible. But that journey has specifically been hindered because of gender feels, and I would argue even sexuality feels. That's a whole other thing we don't have a time to get into a side tangent about. But so it was really important for me in the beginning of my witchcraft journey, really just to find a place of power that wasn't what it feels like so many books were telling me it was. And even so many teachers, I went to a few public offerings and rituals and classes when I lived outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And even in those, it was very much that. And it does come from good intentions. I really think it does. It comes from that second wave point of view of wanting to focus and highlight the feminine. But when you are tying that to biology, you are hurting so many people, even if you don't mean to be. Even people who, like you described, are cisgender, but really have trauma and trouble connecting with that and with that area. And so I think there's just a less harmful way to do magic. And sure enough, when we talk about less harmful, it becomes more inclusive and more people are welcome. And I think when we think about not being inclusive, we think that that's somehow our right. That's somehow like something we're allowed to do. But when you think about exclusivity as what it actually is, which is exclusivity and hurting people, I hope most people have good hearts and would kind of open up and find a new way to work through things.
Thank you.
Did you have a follow-up on that, Andrea? And if you wouldn't mind, share what Kristen just...
Oh, sure. Well,
I can't get through that without without losing my shit.
I'll read Kristen's. It's beautiful. This is from Kristen Adesi. I was already crying with the dedication. I have the book and need to read it. And as a trans non-binary person, I feel your pain. I had a total hysterectomy and felt so different, feeling like I wasn't a woman anymore. Sometimes I feel more boy, but I've learned how to love my woman side. I love being a nasty woman.
My own gender is fairly fluid. I think since starting my vaginismus journey, it has been firmly non-binary. It has been like dysphoria is just wild. I really think that's because of just what I'm working through. But when I am still able to tap into the sides of me that do sometimes lean, I won't even say feminine or female, but like lean kind of femme of center. I do like getting dolled up. I do, and again, I just hate how much things are gendered, because even as I say that, my activist brain is like masculine of center, like people like getting dolled up too. So it's like difficult to navigate.
Another friend of the show and former guest, Richard Levy, writes, you found words of power to speak to the souls of witches who all feel like outsiders. It gives power to the queer and marginalized to heal and to enchant. And with that, I want to say, one of the best ways for people to get there, in our opinion, is to start by reading your book.
Thank you.
So, I truly mean that, and they're not, those who know me know that I'm being autistic, have no filters, and so I don't give compliments away easily. It just is a part of how I'm wired. And we actually just got a message from Rosemary that was Rosemary speaking. She's on Kristen's computer. So hello, darling, and those of you who watch the show know that Rosemary was my guest, my co-host. She was my Rachel Maddow for our election night coverage. With my alter ego, Angelina Serafina Tutacosa. But tell us, Cassandra, what in your opinion is the best way for the person who gets this, who understands that everything you've said makes sense? What would you say are the three greatest challenges that a person can expect when they attempt to put into practice what you outline in your book?
So I think some of the challenges are ultimately good, and they're how you grow. They're how you learn and evolve and adjust. And one such challenge is, I talk a lot about self-acceptance, finding your own, not only center of power, like we were talking about, but finding your own sort of sense of intuition, finding your own, I guess I'm actually trying to say, trust your own voice, trust your own intuition. And I do lay out some exercises, some journal prompts, some ways you can do that. And I still think it's just hard to do that. Like, I unfortunately don't have a magic wand that I can just wave at people who want to get there faster, because the progress, the change, the self-love, it's in the work. It's in sort of going through that journey and facing that challenge. By the same token, I would say that also the shadow work piece is going to be difficult. I think for a lot of queer and marginalized people, and I actually wish I'd been able to put this into words in the book because I've only done it afterwards, but a lot of times queer and otherwise marginalized people, your shadow selves are actually just mirrors of the society we live in that tells you how much is wrong. And we have to learn to embrace those sides of ourselves, even the ones that have accepted that and sort of internalize those messages, but also the side of ourself that those messages are speaking against. And again, it's hard, but it's supposed to be hard. I don't know a single person who is like, oh yeah, my shadow work journey was really easy. Like, that's not a thing. So, that is supposed to be difficult. And then something that I just, again, wish, and I hope more people who are not only queer, but more people who are disabled will see that this book is doing okay and write some of their own to give us even more ideas, because I'm one person. A lot of stuff was personal gnosis that I had to be like, this is what's worked for me over the years. But I think the other thing is that's hard is I really tried to bridge that gap of like, okay, well, what do I do with these tools? But sometimes you just gotta figure it out. Like if the examples I give don't work for you, that is going to be a challenge. And if there were more books from this point of view, and certainly if there were more books written by people who didn't have money to live on while they were writing their books, it would be very different. It would be a very different wealth of information that we have. One of the things that
we don't get rich by writing a book.
Well, not at this level. And I'm definitely more comfortable than before I had 2 books out. I'm still not wealthy by any stretch. It's more like I don't need to worry about where my bills are coming from, but I still have to make decisions at the grocery store. And so, and I still have to make decisions at the witchcraft store where things usually are a little bit pricey. And it's like, do I really need these stones? And as much as I want you to support your local witchcraft store, if you're struggling at the grocery store, the answer is no, you don't. You can use something else. And so that's really what I tried to bridge there.
And there's another comment from Rosemary that says, the shadow work journey was so difficult. The dysphoria was heartbreakingly intense. I can't imagine my life without having gone through that. And I think that's that can be something that comes back to many people who read your book, is you show how you also talk a lot about how you overcome those challenges. And that was one of the things that I think was so inspiring, because you're not just, laying it out in this, it's incredibly encouraging and inspiring and supportive of anyone who is feeling like they've been marginalized, not just in the world, but also marginalized in witchcraft. And I think that kind of led to one of my other questions from the book, was one of those questions that has been marginalized, and I absolutely love your take on it, is the harm none. That was huge for me.
So I don't like putting pagan faiths down at all.
Yeah.
For me personally, that was one of the tenets, and the rigidity of the expectation to stick to it that really kind of drove me away from, I won't even repeat what it was, but the earlier paths I was looking at within sort of pagan witchcraft community. I think for some people, maybe it does work. I don't know. I ironically think end it harm none is a really harmful stance to take, because it spiritually bypasses so much stuff, especially about money. I think me sort of becoming, it feels like every passing year I go a little more left politically. And I just want everyone to be okay. And I mean everyone. And that does involve moving a little more left and a little more left. But when I started looking at that specifically in, I will even say, our capitalist framework that we live under in the US, even just doing a money spell, if you're going to say end it harm none, well, you're not going to get that money. Someone has to hurt for other people. And, I have a lot of guilt of my own to work through, as my income does also slowly increase every year. I try to remind myself that you can give back more and do more, and when you have more. And so I definitely have some of my own blocks up where that's concerned. But getting back to the original thing, you have to recognize that there was harm somewhere. Another example I give that is sometimes easier for people to understand and swallow, and I do give this one in the book, is if you're doing a spell to bring the right person to you, if you're saying and it harm none, then you are assuming that neither you nor this person have anyone who is going to have a feeling about the two of you getting together in your life. And that is false. Almost all of us have an ex that is still hoping something happens, or a crush we don't even know about. Someone we don't even know about has a crush on us. And the part of me that just likes attention is like, well, I hope that's true. But like generally speaking, it is. And so, when I say that, people start to be like, oh, okay, I kind of see what you mean now. And so I guess I don't even want to say harmful frame, but it's almost like a nonsensical framework to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, because what can you really achieve within that? And so the flip side of it is very like, again, comes from that second wave feminist. We want to empower women, but we don't want to do what's been done to us. But that same white feminism excuses a lot of really bad behavior when it comes to race, when it comes to disability. I would even say when it comes to queerness, that is not just being gay. And even among straight women, among that same crowd, there's a lot of sex negativity and stuff, even while they do womb worship. And again, just sort of some weird framework there. And so, yeah, and I think when we say end it, harm none, we're telling people who have indigenous practices or practices that go back to their ancestry in Africa, in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, that the work they do that does sometimes try to bend will, that is sometimes fiercely protective to the point of harm, that their work is bad. And that is really racist for a white person to say or to deem. I'm a big fan of calling things what they are, even if it makes people mad. And like, that is a racist framework to come from.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you so much for saying that. You know, it is, I think one of the greatest struggles that Andrea and I talk about on so many of our shows is the colonialism that gave birth to this absurd and really disgusting notion of black magic versus white magic or gray magic.
I touch on that too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I appreciated that in your book. And so what I'd love to, I mean, we could probably sit here for another 2 hours and talk, and maybe one day when this pandemic is over, we'll be able to do a live everybody in the same room show, and I would love that. But what I'd like to do as we kind of wrap up today, of course, is thank you for just the generosity of spirit, the generosity, the authenticity that you bring to your book in a world where there are lots of books out there that give good basics and good foundational information, and some that give a nice little, you know, fresh update and spin on what the sacrosanct elders of this branch or that branch of witchcraft have taught. But I think what you brought was really breathing new life into especially the craft and the journey for LGBTQ plus persons. But also, I would challenge all of our viewers, regardless of how you identify, to really pick up this book, because I promise you it's going to breathe new life into your own practice. It's going to cause you to look at that place where you're marginalized and find the magic there. You know, Cassandra, tell me what your the biggest takeaway would be that you've learned in your practice that you hope that readers will get when they read your book.
That is a good question, and I love the wording of it and the framing of that. I would say the big takeaway, honestly, is there is a way to do magic and access spirit without oppressing yourself, without hurting yourself. And there is a way to, and I'm careful when I say this because spirituality is not total liberation. We live in oppressive systems still. But I would say that spiritually, there is a way to liberate yourself from that. And I think that would be the biggest takeaway is, and then like just listen to your own, you know, with my tarot book, I always said, listen to your own gut, but I don't even think it's that with witchcraft. I think it's like, listen to your whole body. Your body is going to tell you if it can or can't do something or doesn't want to when it comes to witchcraft and when it comes to spellcraft. So listen to your body. If you're feeling some resistance, that is maybe not for you. And that's okay. It's not for you, probably because your body is trying to protect you, because maybe you have some chronic pain and it's just not going to work. Or maybe you haven't done the shadow work to go into that spell and your body is having some feelings about it. Or so I would say listen to your body. And a lot of times in disability, in chronic pain community, I don't want to say listen to your body. I'm very careful about how I talk about bodies. I think in this case, it still stands. I think if your body is like mine and full of pain, and if that zings more, if you try to do something, do not try to do that thing. And going back to my original big takeaway, you just have to find a different way that does work for you. There are still ways to access that magic.
Yeah, I think we can listen to our body, especially for those of us in chronic pain. We can listen to our body without letting our body dictate every decision that we make. And we can allow ourselves to be informed by what the body's telling us. Andrea, any other questions that you want to ask as we wrap up?
Well, yes. There's so many.
You're like me, there's probably 1,000 questions.
I know. Well, I want people, first of all, to know how they should get in touch with you first. Should that be a Facebook thing, Twitter? What's the best place if people have questions? Because your book is great.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm probably most active on Instagram, which is Tarot Cassandra. And then I am on Twitter. It's Tarot_Cassandra, which is like a thorn in my side because someone else had Tarot Cassandra and they don't use it. So Twitter is Tarot_Cassandra. And then going to the website, there's stuff about where to buy my books. I think there's stuff about supporting my work on Patreon, and there are monthly offerings on my Patreon, or weekly offerings on my Patreon. You pay monthly or annually. But if anyone is listening and wants to run right over to my Patreon, it's patreon.com/Cassandra Snow. I made that one very easy for you.
And I would recommend that. And the other one too is I think part of what you were saying before about listening to your body and making that work and following that is your whole section on do-it-yourself Sabbaths and do-it-yourself ritual. I loved that whole thing because you took out, one of the ones was birthdays or death dates too, making those your celebration instead of sticking with something that might not work, because of if you're disabled, maybe you can't go do some of the things like tread the mill or all of those types of activities. You created this whole section of really inspiring ideas of how to do it yourself. So I love that.
Thank you. Yeah. No, that was always really fun for me. And it's also just something I've always done. I'm a very celebratory person. I am very just, I guess, lucky in terms of personality for all of my trauma. I learned to see the humor in everything. I learned to celebrate the wins that you did get. And I know that that's difficult for some people. And unfortunately, I don't have advice on it. And I think that your normal human reaction is totally fine. But it is something I've just always done. And so when I started getting into witchcraft, I was like, these are great. What if more? And so I started creating that. And then, I think one day I'll probably celebrate as a Sabbath the day that I went into treatment for vaginismus. That day is not today. I am not ready for that. But, I think the crossroads days in our lives are so important. And even one thing I talk about too is in the book is you don't even have to have a huge celebration planned. You don't have to plan a whole themed day. You don't, but just recognition of the day is special. Maybe even just lighting a candle or putting a specific oil on is enough and is good if you want it to be enough. And so, yeah, I really love doing that work. And I love if someone is either studying under me or even just asking me questions. I love helping them find like days that are really worth celebrating to them.
Right on. Well, the book is Queering Your Craft, Witchcraft from the Margins. The author is Cassandra Snow, and we are so absolutely grateful to have you here. Thank you so much for being here, and hope that you'll come back again. And maybe we could dig a little deeper on some of these topics in the new year. For our viewers, this will be our second to the last program of the season here at the Masca and the Mystic. So next week, or in 2 weeks, will be our final show. We do every other week. So we encourage you to share this with folks. Like I said, if you didn't think so in the beginning of this program, hopefully by the time you listened to what Cassandra had to share, you're going to know, like me, 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 people who, really could benefit from the insight and the wisdom and just that generosity of heart that I really found Cassandra's work to bring to the discussion. And this show is really all about that. It's about that discussion. It's about the emergent conversation. So Cassandra, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you both so much for having me.
Thank you.
And Andrea, it's always a pleasure, and I'm so grateful. I'm going to be dashing in a minute to go and sign a lease for our new place that we move into in January, so that hopefully, instead of these kinds of backdrops to hide all of the boxes stacked behind me, there'll be a nice backdrop in my room that I won't have to worry about putting up a screen. Everybody, thank you so much for being here. As we say at the end of every one of our programs, we encourage you to stay in the moment, to bring your presence and awareness to this moment, because that's where the power is. That's where the insight comes. That's where you're able to begin to explore that abundance that resides within you, and to fill that moment with gratitude. And remember that even in the roughest of times, life follows the seasons, so the best is yet to come. We'll look forward to seeing each and every one of you in a couple weeks, and thank you for being here.
Hi, I'm Adrian Grenier, and I'm a guy you might know. That's why I've chosen to speak to you today, because you know my story. Well, some of it anyway. But what if you knew everyone's story? What if everyone on the planet was familiar to everyone else? The Charter for Compassion wants to find out. They're asking you to tell them a piece of your story. One moment of compassion that changed your life. Each story will be inspiring in its own right, but all of them together will reveal a world of compassion happening right now in places all over the world, as diverse as Kentucky all the way to Pakistan and everywhere in between. Imagine it. Thousands of stories told one person at a time. Someone once said, there isn't anyone you couldn't learn to love once you've heard his or her story. Stories make us care. Stories help us understand. Stories breed compassion. And if there's one thing we need right now, in our politics, in our dialogue, in our communities, in our world, it's compassion. Go to charterforcompassion.org and tell your story. And while you're there, affirm the Charter and make a commitment to make the world a more compassionate place. But it's only the first step. Now it's time to practice. It's the only way to a peaceful world. I can't wait to hear your story.